There is more to the story from the United States about what they hope to accomplish through this 30-day reprieve. And J.D. Vance, the vice president, was pretty explicit about it. Have a listen.
Well, a number of industries have reached out to us to ask us for exceptions to the tariffs, but I think the president's been very clear here that he wants the tariffs to apply broadly. He doesn't want to have 500 different industries getting 500 different carve-outs, and the way to avoid application of the tariffs is to have your factory and have your facility in the United States of America. That is the way. Invest in America. That is how you will avoid being penalized by these tariffs.
Ontario's Premier Doug Ford says the 30-day reprieve should not be considered good enough to stop Canadian counter-tariffs. Have a listen.
Because as far as I'm concerned, the tariffs are still on. We will not relent. And I apologize to the American people. It's not your fault. There's one person, again, to be blamed, and that's President Trump. But we're going to go full steam ahead.
All right, let's talk about this with our front bench. With me this evening, Laura D'Angelo is with Enterprise Canada and previously worked in Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's office. Jamie Ellerton is a conservative strategist and the founding partner of Canaptus Limited. Former interim NDP National Director Carl Belanger is with us. He's now the president of Traction Strategies. And Hannah Thibodeau is a former news anchor. She's now an executive communications officer at Global Public Affairs. Hi, everyone. I think most of you heard the bulk of that press conference, and certainly I know we've all been following what I've been calling all night, Laura, the bouncing ball, right? What the position that Doug Ford has taken, essentially that this isn't enough, or some, a carve out here, a carve out there, or a reprieve here, or a reprieve there, will not be enough to get Canada to back down on counter tariffs. How steely do you think the resolve around that will be in the federal government and elsewhere?
I think at the federal level, and certainly for most provinces, probably pretty strong, because it is impossible. I think the Foreign Affairs Minister has said this already. It is impossible to plan for an economy month by month. You can't do that to Canadians. Doug Ford has been so strong on this, right? And so human. When we see him come out and talk directly to Americans like that and say, I'm going to turn your lights off and I'm going to do it with a smile, frankly, but also telling them it's not his fault. I take him at his word right now. I think where things are going to get really tricky is when things start to get really bad, right? People have not yet lost jobs. Food bank usage is still at a terrible level, but it hasn't gotten worse. And soon things are going to get really hard, and that's when the hard decisions come.
Jamie, what's your read on the fact that Trump appeared to blink after hearing from these big CEOs of these huge companies, even though it's 30 days and they're couching it in, well, this will force you at the end of those 30 days, if you want to avoid tariffs, to move all your business to the U.S. And that's certainly something we need to take seriously. But the fact that somebody was able to make an economic argument to him about a negative impact to his policy, and he actually appears to have listened in some way today, do we take anything from that, or is this more of a one-off, do you think?
It kind of seems like a one-off right now, Vashi, but I think President Trump kind of told on himself in his address to the joint session of Congress yesterday. It was clear that the big three automaker CEOs in Detroit were in the president's ear, talked about the very real impact this was going to have on American jobs, and they've got to negotiate themselves a temporary reprieve. And it really has nothing to do with Canada and more with how the U.S. auto manufacturing would be impacted by these measures. I think when you bring this back closer to home, we're now going on month 4 of having premiers and the federal government kind of running around talking to anyone they can to try and deliver a message, but they're not actually taking action on other stuff that could be improving. We talk about the impact on Canadian steel and aluminum. It'd be great for Canadian steel, building pipelines across the country and getting it laid into the ground so we can get other resources to market. You've not seen any of the needed, there's kind of almost agreement, there's long-term things we need to do to make Canada better, but we're going on month 4 with inaction and Parliament's being shuttered, and this kind of shuttle diplomacy of crisis, screaming, ooh, what are we going to do, living to that bouncing ball that you just talked about, is ultimately preventing us from taking the long-term action we need to start to set ourselves on a new path, which is lessening our reliance on the United States.
That is certainly the gist of the conservative argument right now, or the conservative criticism, Carl, to the government, that basically the actions that they are taking in the moment are more Band-Aids, and that the kinds of solutions that we appear to have more consensus on, I don't know if it's absolute consensus, but more consensus than we might have 2 years ago, haven't actually, there's no action necessarily at this juncture being taken on them because, A, there's a lame duck prime minister, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but obviously he's got a few more days left. And we have had, the Liberals prorogued Parliament in the interim until their new leader was chosen. Does that argument, do you think, land?
I'm not sure it lands with Canadians because the threat is not coming from inside, it's coming from outside. And the fact that, we could build pipeline, it won't solve the problem in the short run. We won't be able to build a pipeline tomorrow to get that product to market. But where there is an argument to be made is that we do need to diversify our economy. And clearly, we've been talking to Europe. There's been many trips by Canadian officials, including the Prime Minister, to Europe. We need to look at strengthening our relationship with Mexico and other Latin American countries. Brazil comes to mind as well. And frankly, if Donald Trump wants to play this game, then we need to look at China and what we can do with there, starting with one example, electric vehicles. 100% tariff, what for? Maybe we can lift that and start to get those products into Canada. If the Americans want to play like that, we can too.
Although inherent in that are, I imagine, some national security concerns. But as Carl points out, the sort of flipping on the head of the relationship with the U.S. In a number of different respects probably means that everybody's thinking about things in different ways. Hannah, your take on, I guess, the resolve around whether we hold tight on counter tariffs if he starts, because the White House, I should also say today, didn't just say 1 month reprieve on the auto sector. They also, the press secretary there, left open the door to the possibility of other carve-outs, which was very interesting to me.
Actually, very interesting, other carve-outs. But as you follow along the timeline of the day, you see J.D. Vance a little bit later saying, no, move your companies down here, and that's the way that you're going to avoid 25% tariffs. A little bit later, you heard from Howard Lutnick, again going back to the reasoning of fentanyl. And even at one point, I heard him mention potentially stopping bad people, terrorists, from coming across the border. So they're throwing out every reason. There's only one person who makes up this decision in the end, and that's Donald Trump, President Donald Trump. So what he says on Truth Social, what he decides to do, that is the person who's ultimately going to make the decision. And yes, I agree with both Jamie and Carl when it says we need to diversify markets. But if I was sitting in the Prime Minister's office right now, and I'm not, and I don't know if I even have the big enough brain to give them this type of advice, but they got a reprieve today on the auto sector. They got a reprieve on the auto sector because the big three went down there and they told Donald Trump this is bad. So who is he listening to right now? He's listening to top CEOs. So yes, before we were out there, we were talking to governors, we as Canadian diplomats, politicians, governors, other people who are trying to influence the man that will make that decision. Clearly, it's people like the CEOs of the big auto sectors. So now get in, start talking to them, and figure out how to get it removed from different sectors, because the only person that's going to make that decision in the end is going to be President Trump.
It's almost as if money talks to Donald Trump.